Hey H&K fans, James here with another video for you. I'm once again taking advantage of late night access here to the gray room here at our headquarters at HK USA to provide you another video. And the reason for this tonight is twofold. The first of which, our recent release of the new A4 series of the MR line has really sparked another kind of rejuvenation of my affection for the 416 series. And the other reason is we just finished final editing and pre-order on the new volume 4 of the Vickers Guide HK series books, which has quite a bit of information on the 416 series and the initial HKM4 program that it was derived from. So I thought I would take advantage of the opportunity, the weapons that we have here in the gray room and what we've got over in our training armory to showcase some of those earlier models and the features that maybe you guys aren't as familiar with or maybe have never seen before. I may do some other videos later on specific variants of the models, but today we'll just keep it to these earlier models. So I hope you guys are excited as I am. I hope you have a comfortable place to sit and have yourself a tasty beverage. Trust me, I am fully caffeinated for this evening, and we'll dive right in. Okay, so let's start out with a little history. And where was H&K at this time? This really falls into what I call the second generation for H&K, where they had moved away from the stamped steel roller delayed firearms that they'd really got their start with and moved into new designs, the polymer constructed weapons, and specifically here with this awesome Armorer's Cutaway G36, the use of a short stroke gas piston operated system. Very successful for them, and they found themselves at the end of the 1990s with a really unique project that was presented them to by the British military to fix their SA-80 bullpup design. They took some of these same features that they developed in the G36, modified them into the SA-80, and found that to be a great project for them to take an already existing design and fix those issues. Then this got turned into contact with the Navy SEALs, who were using AR-15 based, M4 type weapons, and were having challenges with the reliability of those weapons and the hard use and austere environments that they're working on, and had approached H&K in a solution. And they were already thinking about how they could adapt, again, this gas piston short stroke gas piston design into that system. And then enter our friend Larry Vickers from the Vickers Guide project, who was at that time working with Delta and had approached H&K about a 1911 specific project, but while he was there in Germany, was able to get his eyes on some blueprints for this project that they were working on with the SEALs at the time, and that spurred the continued interest because Delta, like the SEALs, had been having similar problems with their AR-15 based weapons. Especially once they got the barrels shorter, when you went down to around 10 inches, and when you're running them suppressed, they had real challenges with the reliability of the weapon, spurred his interest, and that started a discussion about maybe kicking this program off in full. An agreement was reached where Delta would provide the off-the-shelf commercial variants for H&K to do their design work, and that led to what would become the HKM4 program. Really interesting process in a time period where H&K was able to rapidly put these projects through R&D, and they did so by simply modifying the original AR-15 direct gas impingement system with the gas piston system on the G36. So if you look here on this cutaway, you can see the barrel and the gas block, and then moving above there, this part in silver is the gas piston itself. And then you can see behind it is the operating rod that would then impart itself onto the bolt. So what did H&K do? As you can see here with this example of an upper receiver, they basically just modified the gas block here to take those same components out of the G36. Same gas piston here in the front, operating rod. You can see they just removed the opening here where the gas tube would normally be, left the delta ring in place, and then made a modification to the bolt, and we're able to make these guns run on this new system. They would also modify the recoil buffer system with a heavier spring and a different buffer because the impulse that's imparted on the gun in a gas piston operating system is significantly heavier than it is in a direct impingement system. They took these examples, brought them back over for some testing with Delta. They made some minor changes, and then very rapidly brought these to the market to release at SHOT Show. They were marketed as the HKM4 because at the time, the U.S. military had recently adopted the M4 as their new rifle. This was H&K's modification off of that. When you see these weapons, those early weapons, you might have seen them in a couple of different variants, and I've got some examples here. This one here, if you look at the receiver, it's marked HKM4D. And this is how, for a period of time, the 416s that would later follow were also marked as well. You can see here I've got an early production HK416D. The D standpoint relates to defense. At the time, H&K had split itself here in the U.S. on two different companies, HK Defense that handled all the government, military, federal law enforcement contracts, and then HKI or USA that would handle all the commercial stuff. And this was a delineation for that. Most people just see it as the D side and they're like, well, I never saw like an MR556I or whatnot. But here is an example of these two early guns. This one, as I just showed you before, HKM4D, is actually the longer, 20-inch barrel, much more like an M16A2 of the time period. But there was also an intent in this early stage to also create an HKM4C, C standing for commercial. Same weapon, but in semi-automatic only for the commercial market. This was not initially fielded like the HKM4D became the HK416, immediately went into military and law enforcement contracts. It would take a few years later before this would actually come to market as what we know as the MR556 line. But it's really neat to see the difference of, in those early days, the decision between HKM4D and C models, the D for defense and the C for commercial models. These original guns were done as before H&K had industrialized all the manufacturing. So when you saw them released, they had an H&K receiver, upper and lower receiver. They had H&K barrels. Obviously, the gas blocks on the guns were H&K's designs, but a lot of the other components were straight off the shelf. In fact, talking with Larry, he recalled actually having a parts list that he had to go out to all of these individual vendors in the U.S. and purchase these parts, send them back to Germany so they could outfit all the weapons. We have some examples in here on the wall. This one up here has a Veltor stock. We have another one that's got a, this one here's got a Bushmaster stock on there. Things like the barrel nut and the buffer tube extension nut, the end plate, selectors, grips, all magazine releases. These initial components were all off the shelf from the U.S. The differences were on things like the upper receiver and on the lower receiver. One of the things that's really noticeable on a 416 or in this variant, the original HKM4, is the angle of the magazine well. On a standard AR pattern, it's much more swept up the front. But one of the things that H&K learned from the SA80 program, which has a longer front end on their magazine well, was that helped stabilize the magazine, especially when you were in a prone position. And I can attest to this. I'm sure many other guys who had military service can attest to this. Back when we had the really cheap magazines pre-Global War on Terror, when you'd have those magazines, there was a lot of play in the magazine, especially if you're down in the prone and you're kind of monopoding on your magazine. On a standard AR pattern magazine well, you could have the magazine tip far enough that the round wouldn't go into the chamber. So by elongating the front of the magazine well and then going to the same high reliability magazine that H&K had actually designed back in the G41 program, carried over to the SA80 program, you now had a much more reliable magazine for it. So that was a unique feature. The magazine itself, steel construction, very solid. Obviously the downside is some weight, but it also was the first one to have the anti-tilt follower. On those earlier magazines, you could get the front of the back of the follower to tip in, and then you'd have issues with loading or feeding the weapon. On these, you don't have that issue. So that was one of the main improvements on the initial guns. Some of you guys may have, you hear the name HKM4, and you're like, well, why did it go to HK416? Well, when it was released, Colt actually pushed through a lawsuit claiming that they had the trademark to the name M4. They later lost that case, but H&K had already made a decision to just go ahead and change the name, and they went with HK416. What's interesting about that is you can find some of these early weapons where that decision had already been made, but the guns had already been released. So some of them you'll see will just have a sticker that's placed over the original HKM4D engraving, and some of them will actually have the actual engraving milled out and then filled in with kind of some white lettering, HK416. So that's one of the unique features of that. Some other initial changes on the original guns. You can see this one here is pretty unique with having this kind of early position Picatinny handguard. When you look at these original models up here on the wall, you can see they still have the AR-15 M4 style two-piece clamshell handguards. But H&K was looking for having more adaptability based off of the user requirements to be able to mount optics and vertical grips and lights and things on there. So this was an example of their original design, and you can see it's still mounted to the Delta ring that they had on there. This didn't last very long because one of the things that those end users were really looking for was the ability to have a return to zero on those initial handguards. So if you mounted a laser on there, they wanted to be able to take the laser off, put it back on, have the return to zero, and they didn't want it flexing with the barrel. In a design like this, it does. So what H&K would do is take that same kind of design when they carried it over to the original HK416 and adapt it to actually mount to the barrel nut. So no more Delta ring. Now we have an extended barrel nut that the handguard will then mount to on there. So here's an example of the handguard removed, and you can see this one mounting point, and then you can see here on this HK416 upper receiver, you can see the elongated barrel nut. You can see the little holes on there that allow us to use the torque wrench and special tool to remove it. But then the handguard would mount over top of that. And you can see the little groove cut in there, which is where the mounting screw mounts to. You can also see there's a little tongue and groove mount on here. So this allowed the handguard to now mount to the receiver and not to the barrel itself, and be true to return to zero. The other thing that's interesting on these original ones, you can see this strange pattern. It looks kind of like a Phillips head screwdriver. It's actually deeper than that. The intent behind that was to be removable in the field. So what H&K did was they intended it to, you would be able to use the lugs on your bolt head, mount those here in the screw, and then turn those to remove it from position. So very interesting. Since then, we've gone to either like a flathead screwdriver mount, or now the latest HK416s have a quick release throw lever on the handguard release there. But that's a unique update that was done in those earlier weapons. The other thing that's interesting here to note, this is one of the original HKM4D bolt carriers. And you can look at, if you're familiar with a standard AR pattern, it should look very familiar to it. You have your gas key here on the front, but what you'll notice is this is not hollow, it's filled in. So the intent was that the operating rod would impact onto this and then move it back to the rear instead of the gas tube pushing gas into there. But what they found from a reliability standpoint was it was easier just to remove this point that might be found as a weak point. When they went into full production HK416, now you just see it's completely cut off there, and this is now referred to as the anvil, the hammer hitting the anvil here on the top of the bolt carrier. The other unique feature on these earlier ones, you can see that these are kind of in the white, or if you look at the ones that are up here on the wall, or this example that I've got here, you can see more of like a plum coloring on the bolt carrier. These later variants, one of the safety features that was built into them is the use of a firing pin block spring or a drop safety. And you can see as I push up on this, it clears the space for the firing pin to actually be hit. So it takes the action of the hammer moving forward to sweep the drop safety out of position to then allow the hammer in order to impact the firing pin. That was a unique feature. The other thing that's not in the original HKM4Ds that is in the newer 416s is a firing pin spring, which helps to, as a safety feature as well. You have to have resistance overcome in order for the firing pin to hit there. So you can't just shake the bolt carrier and have the gun go off. So that's another feature. We'll talk about some of the OTB stuff in another video. I think I've mentioned that before. It wasn't on the earlier guns. Another couple of unique features on the early weapons, this HKM4D, you'll notice there is no dust cover on the weapon. That wasn't initially part of their contract requirement, but then when they got deeper into it and the customers decided that that's what they wanted, then those were added back. You can also notice the unique sighting design that they offered initially with these guns. No surprise that H&K would reach back into what people are really familiar with and use their rear diopter drum, the 4-position setting here at the rear, and then the hooded front post that we're also familiar with from the G3 and the MP5 design. But now you can see that they cut off the top of the post, because at this point all the end users were mounting some kind of optic above, so they allow you to still see through and use your iron sights depending on the mount you had, but the top of that hood wouldn't interfere with your optic crosshairs or red dot. So that's a unique feature, and this is carried over as well to some of the other designs that we have here for H&K. Another improvement that was made once they went to the actual HK416D models that you can see here on the handguard is here on the end. So there is a hole in the handguard, and that exposes this hole that's in the bottom of the gas block. And here's an example of the 14.5-inch model. You can see the hole right through the bottom of the gas block. This was designed to rapidly mount and dismount your grenade launcher module. So prior to this design, if you had an M16 and M4 and you wanted to mount the M203, this was an armor level task in order to mount that on there. H&K had adapted their grenade launcher modules in different variants for use with the M16, M4 platform. I'll do a separate video on those. It's actually pretty cool. But to showcase it, how it works here, when they created their grenade launcher module update for the 416 series, they changed the top section. You can see this one here is a telescoping buttstock that allows me to fire it as an individual shooter, a standalone weapon, but they also adapted these mounts here on the top. Look at this cutaway model where I've already just removed the extendable stock from the rear, and if you pull this captive cross pin that you see here off to the side, and then I take any of the 416s or even 417 variants that have this style handguard, I simply adapt it onto the Picatinny rail at the bottom, push the cross pin through the gas block, and now I have a grenade launcher module attached to my weapon. I can fire it in this standpoint, or if I decide I want to go back to a standalone capability, I just pull that pin, slide it back off, reattach the telescoping buttstock for it, and it's back into a single fire mode as a standalone weapon. That to me is a very adaptable capability. There are definitely going to be times when your end users may want to have two standalone weapons. They don't want the extra weight, and maybe it's cumbersome to have to run around with both of these on the weapon all day long for long patrolling. But there might be a short raid mission where instead you actually want it mounted on your weapon, and this is a unique capability that they carried over with this new 416 style handguard design. Okay, thinking about some last minute comments here on the original HKM4D 416 series. A couple other things I'd want to mention. Originally designed around the 14.5 inch barrel lengths and the 10.4 inch. They also offered a 16.5 and a very rare 20 inch model. You don't see those very often, but the majority of the ones we saw were 10 inch and 10.4 inch and 14.5 inch. The other things that we saw incorporated into later variants, one was the ability to put the safety on regardless of the position of the hammer. So you notice right now I'm in fire. I try and put the weapon on safe. I can't until I cock the weapon. Once the hammer's cocked, then I can put it on safe. This was seen as a safety related issue. So in later variants of the 416, they updated it where you can put the weapon on safe regardless of the position of the hammer. One of the other things that we get a lot of questions about that's pretty cool was for some of their maritime related customers. They had requirements to be able to immediately come out of the water and be able to fire. And in a traditional AR-15 design, if you've got water in the weapon and you do that, you're going to destroy your weapon. So HK created the over the beach or OTB features. You can see here at the rear of the buffer tube, you have these 3 drain holes. So any water that's in the buffer tube will drain out there through the back of the stock. If you look at the bottom of the bolt carrier, you'll notice a little drain hole as well. So any water that's in there will drain out. And then though I cannot show you here on camera, inside the receiver in the barrel extension where the locking lugs of the bolt lock up to the receiver, there is a detent. And one of the failure points in these weapons, traditional AR-15 designs, if there's water in the barrel, the weapon's fired, the path of least resistance is going to blow the extractor right out of the ejection port. So the little detent that's on the barrel extension, actually, when the bolt is in battery, is placed right on top of where the extractor is. So any pressure that's forcing its way back can't blow the extractor out because it's being forced into its downward position. So that's another unique feature about the 416 design and development as they continued on, leading up to the biggest changes of the HK416A5. But I hope that's a unique look. I hope I was able to show you something that you haven't seen before from these earlier models, and I look forward to presenting at least 1 or 2 more shorter videos on some of the unique variants that we have here at a future date.